Many rural communities are struggling to stay afloat. They're losing people, losing businesses, their schools, even post offices. What can they do to stem the tide or even create a rural revival? I'm Grant Gerlach of NET News and Harvest Public Media. Thanks for joining us for a discussion of those issues on how can we save rural America. We have three guests here to talk about it. I want to welcome Brian Depew, Assistant Executive Director at the Center for Rural Affairs. Brian, thanks for being with us.
Good to be with you, Grant.
Maxine Mowell is the former Lieutenant Governor of Nebraska and the current State Director of Rural Development for the U.S. Department of Agriculture. Welcome, Maxine.
It's my pleasure to be here.
And Caleb Pollard recently stepped down as Executive Director of the Valley County Economic Development Board and is opening a new business in the city of Ord, a brewery, in fact, Scratchtown Brewing Company.
That's correct. Thank you, Grant.
Thanks for being here, Caleb. The first thing I'd like to ask is to describe what's happening in small towns right now. Brian, maybe can you describe the struggle many small towns face?
You're right, Grant, that communities across Nebraska and across the rural Midwest and Great Plains have struggled with declining populations, and some schools have closed, and more recently we've seen the fight over post office closures, which has been stemmed by and large. There's also a lot of opportunity right now in these communities. I think that's kind of the untold story that I hope we'll be able to talk about more today.
Maxine, in rural areas, how much of a town's success or the challenge a town faces is dependent on what happens in the farm economy?
Well, the farm economy has been very good to Nebraska the last several years, but it is also kind of a negative as well, because we often find that farmers and ranchers aren't investing in their rural communities. They buy the larger equipment that's not available in their home community. They're going elsewhere for other services. We really need to encourage those farmers and ranchers to think about their home communities first. But we are really benefiting from the good economy in Nebraska. We've always said that Nebraska doesn't follow the U.S. We don't have the deep lows or the very high economy picture that some of the other states do. But I think when you have spark plugs in communities who are really passionate about their communities, that they can make a real difference in the future.
Caleb, the trend for decades has been people leaving small towns and rural areas, especially young people. For people who live in cities, why should they be concerned about what happens to these small towns?
That's a great question. If you look at Valley County, the community in which I've essentially come from for today's program, our peak population year was 1920. So we're fighting against a 90-year trend that is really kind of created by a fundamental change in the ag economy. We all understand why those things happen. You know, the 1980s had a big deal to do with that. I was a farm kid on the farm in the 1980s, and so I got to see what that was like firsthand. But the reason why I think Lincoln and Omaha and other metropolitan communities, one, should be very, very concerned about the quality of life that exists out in rural communities and the future economic outcomes, is because they're incredibly dependent upon them. The number 2 export of both America and Nebraska is ag commodities. I mean, ag has a very important element of our both local, state, and national economies, and also we provide a lot of talent that moves to urban communities and goes to college there. So the students that they're receiving from a high-quality public education system is really important to their own economies. And so I would think that they would be interested in seeing rural communities survive and thrive, because it has a direct impact on them as well.
So agriculture is really the basis of that rural economy. Do communities need to be careful about being over-dependent on agriculture, Brian?
Yes, Grant, that's, as Maxine said, there's certainly been a boom in the agricultural economy in recent years, and we haven't necessarily seen that translate into a boom in Main Street economies in our small communities. And one of the things that we're really working on is trying to diversify the economies of rural America. And we see there's great opportunity, say take wind energy, for example. In the Midwest, you have some of the states with the greatest potential for wind energy. Nebraska ranks 4th in potential for wind energy, yet lags at 25th in actual installed capacity. And these are really good jobs. The average salary of somebody working on wind farm operations is $46,000 a year. So we need to look at these other sectors, and I think energy is a big one to diversify the economy beyond agriculture.
And the goal would be to bring people back. One thing small towns struggle with is holding on to young residents. We went to the Fillmore County Fair in Geneva, Nebraska to ask about revitalizing rural areas. And here's what people had to say about keeping young people close to home.
Difficult. Both of my 2 kids don't live back in Parkston, and they're not going to live back in Parkston. Their particular professions take them out.
All of our kids that graduate from high school, most of them have to go elsewhere for employment.
I know a lot of friends that have farmed all their lives around here, and it's sad, but they're telling their kids not to come back. They don't know if there's a future. You know, it's hard for their farms to grow. They don't know what's going to happen. It's harder to get ownership of land because it is very expensive. You know, it costs over $1 million to buy a quarter of ground.
We have a Class D school. I'm on the school board, and money-wise now it really isn't an issue as far as our schools. It's the people, the population. And I don't know. I wish I had a better answer for that, but I think we need to get some people up from Lincoln and Omaha to move out here.
One of the themes that you hear from rural areas is, I love the people, I love the place that I live, but the jobs and the career opportunities. Maxine, isn't that the first thing that small towns have to answer, the first concern they have to answer?
It certainly is one of the first things. I think it's very interesting that those clips were from the Fillmore County Fair because that's where my husband comes from. The family arrived there in 1872. My family is from Burke County, and my sister and brother-in-law own and operate the farm there. And I like to point out the fact that my brother-in-law's 3 siblings, all of their children and their grandchildren, except for 2, live in Burke County or very close to it. So they've done an excellent job of keeping their kids in the community. They're in agribusiness. Some of them are in farming. But there are jobs related to agriculture that are very important to small towns. And as Brian said, there's other opportunities to create jobs. Entrepreneurship is a marvelous opportunity for job creation in these communities, and we are seeing it many, many times all over the state of Nebraska. And we're seeing it with people coming home to their hometowns, starting new businesses, and being very successful at that business. One of my favorite stories is about Allo Communication out of Imperial, Nebraska, where the owners came back. The wife grew up with a grocery store in her family. Another one was with the newspaper. They've grown a business on broadband communications all over western Nebraska. They're bringing people home to the community, and they're having kids, and they're populating the schools.
So some ways to create jobs. I mean, Brian, is it there aren't jobs, or there aren't the right jobs, aren't enough jobs? What is the situation you see?
Sometimes we see a skill misfit. We have a local manufacturer in my hometown, Lyons, Nebraska, that says that they have jobs that they would fill if they could find people. And these are jobs in manufacturing and also engineers to work at the manufacturing facility. A key piece of that is community colleges and getting them engaged and making sure that we're matching up folks from those communities, get them trained in the right skills so that they can work in these jobs.
Mm-hmm. And I'd like to add to that too, if I could, Grant,
sure.
is there are opportunities there, especially in the industries related to manufacturing, ag production. We see them in professional services as well. And the key point, I think, in reaction to the clip that was just shown was that it takes the community's leadership really they need to take an engaged and very forceful effort to communicate to the kids in that area and beyond that there are opportunities here and we will help you get connected with them, whether it's through the community college, whether it's through local employers. But it also means that there needs to be carry through on the community side to build communities that people actually want to live in. I mean, there are several rural communities out there that I think sell a false bill of goods in terms of the quality of life that's there. And then there's a tremendous number of rural communities that have amazing amenities and assets. They just aren't telling the story, I think, loudly or proudly enough to people that are looking for what they have to offer. So it's not just about bringing people back, it's bringing people to the community. And I might add, too, is that if we use Detroit, Michigan as the example of urban development on what not to do, I don't think we would have a clear picture of what urban America would actually look like. So we have to be careful, I think, when we talk about rural communities, that all of rural America needs saving. It does, and it's spiky just like urban communities are, and it's oftentimes dictated by that leadership at the local level. You know, urban communities around America look very different because of the engaged efforts of their urban leaders, and rural communities are not any different. There are urban communities and rural communities out there that have a very bright future because of leadership and the things that they've been able to do to take advantage of those opportunities that Brian was talking about earlier.
For communities that do want to add jobs and create opportunities, should they be looking, is it better for them to look for ways to build small businesses or to get larger employers? You know, add 2 or 3 workers at a time or try to get 20 or 30 at a time? Is there a better way to go about it, one better than the other, Maxine?
Well, my background is also with the Department of Economic Development in Nebraska. And we have a lot of communities who simply aren't capable of welcoming a large business into the community because of the skill sets that will be missing for the employees that are needed. Oftentimes we need communities to work together on projects. So one community might be the host of a manufacturing company, but draw on people from other communities within a 50-mile radius, a 75-mile radius. I think it's very important that our rural communities look at collaborating with other communities. Sometimes that's hard to do because of the history between communities, but it's becoming more and more essential that they work together.
Grant, we also think that small business and entrepreneurship is a really critical piece of the puzzle. We offer small business technical assistance all over the state, and ever since the financial crisis hit 3 years ago, demand for those services just exploded, both because people were looking for opportunities in creating their own business, and then when they had a good marketable idea, they went to the bank and they often couldn't find traditional financing. And we make loans to small businesses with up to 5 employees. And in just the last year, we've loaned over $1 million across the state. And that really speaks to the entrepreneurial spirit among rural people.
And maybe that's one of the differences between the towns that are doing well and some that aren't. Not all towns are in the same situation. Some are doing better than others. So what's the difference between towns that are thriving and towns that are fading? We also put that question to people in Geneva at the Fillmore County Fair. Let's hear what they had to say about that.
Keeping the main streets full, I would say. Especially, like I said, since I'm not from a small town, those are the things that I notice, is the towns that have their main streets are full, lined with, you know, businesses in each building. Those are the towns that stay going.
Well, I think your schools, one of the things that I see, if you have a strong system, I think you're going to gain families. A lot of the towns that have lost their schools have a struggle.
I think it all boils down to people and the leadership and the people within those communities that are willing to take a stand and also willing to start new programs and opportunities and good leaders. Small towns that have good leaders seem to hang on.
This is How Can We Save Rural America? I'm Grant Gerlach of NET News with Brian Depew of the Center for Rural Affairs, Maxine Mowell of USDA Rural Development, and Caleb Pollard of Scratchtown Brewery in Ord. That last point, especially about leadership, Caleb, that's something that's kind of hard to quantify. What does rural leadership mean exactly, and how can it make the difference in a town?
Well, I think rural leadership means that you have a collective group of people that's willing to take a stand and call for action, and then follow action with deed rather than words on an outcome that's going to have an impact. So the way we kind of frame that, and the reference that we frame that in Orden and Valley County is, what is your attitude, what is your leadership structure, and what locally controlled resources do you have to make all that happen? And I think leadership is kind of a combination of all of those. You have to have a positive attitude. If we sit and cry in our Cheerios about the lack of things in rural America, I don't think it's going to get us very far. But if we focus on what some of our competitive advantages are, and in that prior clip, it was very well spelled out. The school district is one of the strongest assets that a rural community has when you talk about public education and how it can actually work. And additionally, I also think too is, from a leadership perspective, is a willingness to do what is right, even if it's not popular. And sometimes we get very tied up into essentially doing what's popular rather than what's right, and that doesn't necessarily elicit the type of outcome that we need to really kind of address the types of change that's happening in rural communities. And I would say lastly, and I think this is also probably the most important point, is a willingness of leadership to transition to younger generations. And I think that if we don't continue to focus on that aspect, and that because we have to deal with change, we have to have a continuous change in leadership, and that means mentorship, leadership, and transition. You know, we had talked about the business opportunities that exist in rural communities. Well, one of the biggest opportunities in rural communities is the transition of existing business to younger business owners. And myself, in my prior capacity, we worked very hard to transition a number of businesses to young 30-some-year-old entrepreneurs who are out there actively running these businesses and are growing those businesses and being very successful. So it's a multitude of different issues, but ultimately it requires action, and I think communities have to get off their tails a little bit and do that.
Maxine, from that clip, what stood out to you? What's the difference between communities that are thriving and communities that are fading?
Well, I would agree with Caleb that the schools can be the heart of regenerating a community.
It seems to be how communities kind of measure themselves.
Exactly. But when you're putting together a core of leadership in the community, you need to look beyond the traditional local elected officials, the business owners, to make sure that you include school personnel, the teachers, the administrators, you include the farmers and ranchers, you include women and minorities in that leadership core, and of course the youth. And there are many good examples across the state of communities that have really engaged their young people. They've provided coaches to the young people in entrepreneurship. The 4-H program has an entrepreneurship program that has been going for many years now. There are a number of ways that the communities can get these young people involved as young leaders.
What do you think, Brian, in terms of how leadership can build solutions for small towns? What are some things that they need to do or need to try?
Sure, I would add just two things to the points that Caleb and Maxine made. Absolutely agree, the critical function of leadership at the community level. And then it's also important for rural people to come together across communities to work on issues of public policy at the state level and the federal level that have an impact on their community. And it's something that as rural people we could do a much better job speaking out on policy issues that affect our communities. You know, if you look at funding for some of the work that Maxine does at USDA Rural Development, it has been cut by 1/3 over the last 10 years. Grants and loans for small businesses and for community facilities. And we need to come together as community leaders and make it clear to our elected leaders what sort of resources we need. And then the other area that we see a lot of opportunity is in engaging new immigrants in these communities. You look at the Hispanic population in Nebraska, it's grown from 40,000 in 1990 to 170,000 today. And some of our most vibrant rural communities are communities with large Hispanic populations. And some of the work we're doing is to really engage those communities and help new immigrants become part of the fabric of communities and help them take on some of the leadership roles.
Mm-hmm. Caleb, you've been you're right now part of starting a business. You've been part of bringing businesses to a community. What do they want to see that would change their mind, that would make them say, yeah, we can start our business in a rural part of the state instead of in Grand Island or Lincoln or Omaha?
That's a great question. I think for a lot of people, what you're trying to do is you're trying to find fit. Individuals that are looking for the types of amenities and the assets that you can find in rural communities that aren't available in cities. I have my in-laws, for example, are from Omaha, and I remember the first time that I let my 8-year-old ride his bike across town by himself, and the reaction that my mother-in-law had to his unsupervised traverse across town. It was entertaining, to say the least, because that's not something that you can do every day in a large city. But so there's that family-style atmosphere. Obviously, the schools have something to do with it. But I think also, too, what's important is that you provide evidence in your community that you believe there's a future. And so, again, going back to the points about what makes leadership possible in rural communities is I think, a protracted, long-term focus on investment, self-investment in community. And that self-investment creates, I think, positive attitudes in the business community to then follow that local investment with their own. So if communities feel like there's a future, the private sector responds. And we've seen in our community multiple examples of the public sector, our economic development group, the City of Ord or Valley County, in partnership with our state and federal partners, making strategic investments in